Good evening to you, dear Dr. Gurosmark. Actually, it's almost good night. And good morning to all our guests here in the auditorium and those that join us online. I'm happy to open the second day of our special conference. Special in that it is a meeting of minds, a meeting of relational psychoanalysis and group analysis. Meeting of minds is very much the essence of both relational analysis and group analysis. In fact, there are two different books carrying this title in both theories, written independently from each other. Last night, we could see how the special approach of Dr. Gurosmark is significant both to the relational approach and to group therapy. Since I am myself both a psychoanalyst and a group analyst, I consider the connection that Gurosmark makes between these two approaches quite natural. It seems that for those who connect the two approaches, the group that is within the individual as well as the individual in the group is a natural perception. It reflects the fluidity of ways of being in interactions with our patients, as well as finding the best that suits each of them. What is unique about Gurosmark, however, is the ability to connect even more approaches in psychoanalysis, and we can easily track object relations, Winnicott, and independent school in addition to the relational theory in his approach. And in fact, I talked with Robert before we started, and he confirmed my suspicion that he was actually a British-born person. And then he moved to the United States. So it's very natural for him to connect both object relations, Winnicott, and relational theory that was developed in the United States. Indeed, he adds an important tier to relational psychoanalysis in the concepts he makes, such as the untelling and the unpast, and in the emphasis that we are going to hear this morning, the unobtrusive analyst and companioning. In these terms that he develops, he enriches the relational theory with the option to work with patients who, due to deprivations and traumas in their life, have been impaired in their ability to symbolize and to be in the transitional space so necessary for therapy. For them, the dimensions of space and time, so important in our connection to reality, undergoes collapse, and past, present, and future exist only chaotically. For these patients, Gurosmark argues we need to think differently about our presence in therapy. And we will hear today how he works with a pedophile patient in his chaotic psyche. I am reminded of Gadamer's significant words regarding dialogue, and I quote, "We say that we conduct a conversation, but the more genuine a conversation is, the less its conduct lies within the will of either partner. Thus, a genuine conversation is never the one that we wanted to conduct. Rather, it is generally more correct to say that we fall into conversation, or even that we become involved in it. Conversation has a spirit of its own, and the language in which it is conducted bears its own truth within it. That is, that it allows something to go, to emerge, which henceforth exists." Gurosmark will present a accompanying, non-intrusive, and authentic discourse out which a soul emerges. And later, we will hear two discussions by Uri Levin and Ilana Laor. I will present the discussions later. Robert Gurosmark is one of the central thinkers in the current relational world and field theory. He is training and supervising psychoanalyst in NYU and in other training programs, and also a group analyst. His papers delineating his theory and work with traumatized patients, and they are to be found in leading journals. He's the author of the Unobtrusive Relational Analyst, Explorations in Psychoanalytic Companioning, and he is the joint editor of 2 more books. One is The One and the Many, Relational Approaches to Group Therapy in Heterosexual Masculinities, and the other one is Contemporary from Psychoanalytical Gender Theory. I had the pleasure of having Dr. Gurusmark as participant in a social dream matrix that I conducted, and I also worked with him as co-conductors of the large group in the IARPP conference in New York in 2018. Much of the quality that we can feel in his writing, I also felt on these occasions. So Robert, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Gila. It's lovely to see you. And I want to thank Uri and my old friend Ilana, who are going to be commenting on, hello, on the paper. It's a pleasure to be working with you again. And yesterday, at some point, it seemed like I was talking too fast, so I'll try and go slower. I don't want to take too long, but let's see how we go. If I'm too fast or too slow, please someone interrupt, and let me know. Okay, so this is a paper called Enactments, Narratives, and Traumas, the Unobtrusive and Companioning Psychoanalytic Treatment of a Man with an Addiction to Child Pornography. In previous papers, I have described an approach to psychoanalytic work that suggests that an unobtrusive yet present and engaged analyst can allow the patient's internal world and the sediments of unsymbolized and non-represented past trauma, neglect, and loss, along with fragmented, timeless, and spaceless states, to emerge and find an address in the treatment space and relationship. In this paper, I will continue to develop these ideas, and I will describe my work with a man who, among many psychological issues, struggled with a compulsion to watch child pornography. This is an area that psychoanalysis seems to have been very hesitant to engage with. I'm not an expert in this area, but just a few facts and figures just to orient us. Tech companies estimate that there are over 45 million images of child abuse, sex, and torture on the internet. Other estimates are as high as 70 million. 25% of total search engine requests relate to pornography. And it is estimated that about 12% of all porn websites include images of children. Apparently, it is estimated that there are approximately 3,000 explicitly child pornography websites that can be accessed. All of which that's very short. I spent time on Google looking and reading, but this is a massive issue that psychoanalysis has been very hesitant to engage with. In general, the issue of child pornography is shrouded in disgust, horror, and repulsion. And men, and on some occasions women, who are afflicted in this area are no longer seen as subjects, but as simply evil objects. They are to be ejected from society and from our consciousness. To treat these men as worthy of understanding runs the risk of being somehow seen to somehow endorse or explain away their behavior. When those afflicted with a compulsion to child pornography seek help, typically they find only what we might describe as regulatory or behavioral interventions that seek to extinguish the behaviors with no attention or little attention to the internal worlds and psychodynamics of these men, who they are, basically. Within psychoanalysis itself, there's been only very meager investigation of the phenomena. And on the PEP web, the psychoanalytic online publishing, there is less than a handful of articles that address the phenomena. There's a review by Heather Wood, who I think is British, and it's a short review because there's just a few articles. And she says the internet is not simply revealing an extant phenomena, something that's already there, so much also as acting as a catalyst, facilitating sexual interest in children. She also tells us that apparently, statistically, internet-only offenders rarely proceed to commit what are called contact offenses with children. And she thus concludes that for the vast majority of people, and this is a little quotation from her, for the vast majority of people accessing pedophilic materials online, this appears to represent an extension of sexual fantasy rather than a rehearsal for action. There are statistical studies. They suggest that it is impossible to talk about one kind of person who is involved. There is a heterogeneity to people who are drawn to child pornography. The clinical focus of this paper does not attempt to say something about the whole phenomena per se. That's a massive question. Rather, I want to foreground the value of knowing a person who struggles with this compulsion in the closeness and companioned intimacy that a psychoanalytic treatment can afford. And I address the nature of psychoanalytic healing when the patient's many altered and disturbed states of arousal, damage, and violence are welcomed, known, and transformed, hopefully, in the treatment. Now, psychoanalytic thinking about the etiology and compulsion to child pornography focuses on the fragility of adult sexuality that can unravel when a person is deeply regressed. Just a few of the ideas that I found out there, and they'll make sense. The narcissistic use of and projection onto a child, the displacement of anger and low self-esteem, the eradication of the difference between child and adult, fantastical sexualization, and the sadomasochistic quality of object relations, and the denial of time and death. All of these are relevant to the case I'll be describing. There's a British analyst, Donald Campbell, and he offers a really nice, comprehensive, and succinct psychoanalytic formulation. He focuses on the sequelae, the consequences of acute and cumulative trauma, and the child's identification with the aggressor that forebodes that the later attack on more vulnerable objects or more vulnerable parts of the self and more vulnerable objects in the person of the child. And you'll see as we talk about the case that all of that to me feels very relevant, and that's important, linking trauma, keeping it as keeping our focus on trauma. So let me tell you, I'm going to offer an account of my work with Nick, who struggled for many years with a compulsion to child pornography. Now, I did describe aspects of this initial phase of my treatment with Nick some years earlier in a paper about masculinity, in fact, and I'll briefly recount some of those first years here. Now, as is often the case when working with cumulative trauma and neglect, there is initially very scant capacity for containment, symbolization, and reflective function. So in the initial years of Nick's treatment, they were dominated by evacuation, dysregulation, and the language of mutual enactment, where I companioned Nick in states of over-arousal, too muchness and devastation. I offered receptivity and the metabolizing containment of my own mind. And I think this was crucial in enabling him to gradually trust me and the treatment and to begin to regulate himself and to locate himself, to achieve some control over his compulsion and also begin to think about it, which took some time. Arriving in my office for the first time some years ago, Nick was a recently graduated chemist and had gotten work in the pharmaceutical industry. He was a ball of fury. His hair and his clothes were unkempt and disorderly, seeming to speak of neglect and rage. He raged at almost all authority figures and symbols of power, the supervisors of work, the United States government, and so on. Those who fought the great evil were valorized, were his heroes, especially suicide bombers, the Taliban, ISIS, the 9/11 bombers. I experienced assault, disgust, and violence myself, and I figured I should stay steady and try to create a safe space within which I could find out who this man was. I knew I was already receiving and participating in a barely thinkable experience and narrative of violation and confusion. Which is the idea that patients unconsciously create, as you know, create their inner world in the treatment with you. Your experience is not just a reaction, but is a participation and a narration of such unsymbolized pain seeks a containing mind who can hold, digest, and enable the growth of representation rather than evacuate. And thus I held these experiences quietly and did not engage him in any consideration I didn't engage him in any consideration of what was happening within me. Indeed, over time, he did calm himself and he began to articulate his difficulties with managing his own emotions, his fears, and the rage that could overwhelm him. The most comforting thing for him and for me in those turbulent first months was his dedication and devotion to his girlfriend. They were later to marry and have a family together, which was stabilizing to him and to me, knowing that that was there. He described his upbringing with a mix of pride and confusion. His parents raised Nick and his two brothers in a totally disorganized apartment in one of New York City's housing estates. Nick's father was an inventor and a dreamer. The apartment was full of the father's inventions and jerry-rigged appliances. He's one of these guys who would make things out of found materials, and there was soldering equipment and mechanical equipment and a lot of metal all over the place. Most of these mechanical things did not work, and some of them seemed to, by the sound of it, to have been downright dangerous. The family barely got by on the mother's occasional income as a sales assistant, but the atmosphere in the house valorized the father as a brilliant explorer and experimenter, and taking his family on this amazing adventure. To myself, of course, I questioned everyone's sanity. Nick viewed his father as a hero who would never compromise. His rage was mainly kept for his mother. She left the home when he was 5 and moved in with a sequence of different men. He and his brothers subsequently lived an almost itinerant life, living in various households with the mother's lovers, her lovers' roommates, and sometimes with people he simply could not place. He described how on one occasion, around 8 years old, he was found scavenging for food in the garbage of a building he was staying in with another uncle, whom he barely knew. He was dumbstruck when I suggested that he was neglected. It had never occurred to him. His body and his sexuality were as chaotic as his rage. He believed for some of his teenage years that he was probably gay. He tried to have sex with a close male friend. He was promiscuous and hyperstimulated with young girlfriends. We discussed the issue of possible sexual abuse, and we thought about possible suspects. He could not recall anything specifically, but there were explicit dreams involving his brothers, his friends, some of his caretakers, and many different people. His mind and his memory were an evacuative mess of out-of-control images and stimulation. And he was grounded and also traumatized by the obsession with child pornography. He was excited more than anything by the image of an innocent little girl who looks to be finding pleasure as she is sexually or violently abused. His descriptions of the websites he would visit were difficult for me to hear. Some, as you might imagine, involved screams, torture, and terror, and caused me both physical and psychic discomfort and disorientation. I understood that he both needed me to virtually see what he was seeing, but also to experience what he was not yet able to fully experience. While watching the images, he would be in an altered state of arousal and disconnection from the world, which was paradoxically calming and grounding. After using the porn, he would be besieged with extreme self-hate and self-punishment. I developed an affection and admiration for him, recognizing the courage it took for him to confront and talk about these experiences so frankly. He came to see that his obsession was a form of re-traumatization and self-assault. And I'd actually put it stronger, it's self-murder. And he gradually greatly decreased his use of the pornography. Behaviorally, the treatment was going well. Yet psychically, the compulsion continued to hold a real sway over him, and he frequently dreamed highly stimulating dreams of sexual activities with prepubescent girls as young as 4 or 5. We cannot control our dreams, and there's something so complicated about all the behavioral treatments people get, but we can't legislate people's dreams. He would often seem near to despair. He was working so hard to change himself, yet how could he control his very own dreams? There were periods when the experience of the treatment collapsed into a concrete world where the integrity of his body and his mind became severely challenged. There were explosive rages with me, not helping him enough, and regressions where he would become so upset his talk disintegrated into ramblings and paranoid ideation. Over time, though, he responded to the holding and containing I tried to steadily provide my steady contact with him. And he gradually opened up questions about who am I really? What is this? Meanwhile, he advanced in his career, and most powerfully, he married his girlfriend and they had a baby boy, Billy, who was 3 months old when one day Nick, caught in the schedule overload of work and parenthood, running around doing 1,000 things, he had no alternative but to bring Billy with him in the snuggly. You call it a snuggly, the little carrier, and to bring Billy with him to his session. He entered the office carrying Billy in the snuggly, and I helped him into the office. He had his book bag, his baby bag, his coat. With a little kid, you're carrying a million things. First things first, Billy needed to be changed. Whether he requested my help or whether I simply began to assist, I don't remember, but we worked together like a cohesive couple. We laid out the changing mat, we changed the dirty diaper. I took on the role of the assistant, removing the soiled diaper, and there were wipes, and helping to locate this and that. I produced some toys and Sesame Street characters that I kept in my office closet from work with children. And the room was filled with the sweet and shitty smell of baby poop. My office was transformed. Furniture was moved around, smells, sights, sounds, and swirling around. All the while, Nick was cooing and playing with Billy, and I, of course, was cooing and playing as well, becoming wrapped into the world of babyhood that I had experienced years prior with my own children, and was delighted to be back in that territory. Nick drew Billy into his lap, we cleaned up, and we settled into the session. With no transition, Nick told me a dream, and it was a horror of sex, vermin, violence, and feces, a horror. The switch from the nurturing, playful environment we had constructed to the tortured, abusive world of Nick's dream world was jarring and totally traumatic for me. I experienced it really looking back as a kind of murder, I think, an enacted co-narration of shock and abuse in the nursery, no less, a narrative of trauma that was yet to be known or represented in Nick's psyche. This is an untelling, yes? This is, in the moment, I did not articulate these thoughts and observations. I could barely organize myself, and Nick was flowing in the session. He was having a great session as he associated to the dream, and he and I shifted states back and forth in the session from the focus on the dream to still Billy is there, the little kid, to playing and engaging with Billy. I did not seek to intrude on this multi-layered flow of enacted narration with understanding, or if you like, secondary process. To abruptly intrude would have been to violate, I think, Nick's process and thereby shift the location of the violation to his mind rather than allowing it to stay comfortably in my mind. I understood that I needed to hold it for safekeeping until the treatment field and Nick could tolerate it. Indeed, we did return to the issue of childhood sexual abuse when sometime later he dreamed that he was a small child and was being taken by the hand by a large adult and led down a dark path. The sense of the dream is foreboding, and Nick was left with a sense of something unknown and malignant. No doubt the dream also captured his deep terrors about the treatment itself. Where was all this leading? Where was I leading him? Nick continued in treatment on and off over the following years. His career and family thrived, but he knew that he had to stay vigilant about his compulsion to child pornography. He would initiate the breaks in treatment when he was feeling that he was much better in control of his compulsion and his life. I always accepted his need to take a break from our treatment, privileging respect for his own control of his mind and his body. An online international support group for men who were similarly struggling with child pornography compulsion was very helpful, and it had a 12-step structure which gave a language of abstinence and commitment that provided a degree of psychic holding. He was intermittently involved with that. Last year, Nick reached out and returned to treatment once again, frustrated and somewhat deflated that again he was struggling with the compulsion. He had found himself making a lewd, inappropriate comment at a family gathering, a sexy comment, a sexual comment. And he was struck by the degree that everything is sexualized for him. It reminded him of the years at home after his mother left when he was 4. He would hear his father and the father's girlfriends having sex. The apartment, he felt, was an unbounded mess with no protection for the children. Vivid and dense memories of the details of his early life poured in with a clarity and detail that had previously been elusive. The kids were utterly neglected. His room contained a mattress on the floor with no sheet, nothing more. He and his siblings would feed themselves on whatever they could find, and he remembers trying to wake up his drunken father to take them to school. His mother was only periodically present and for the most part lost in her own world with various partners and drugs. Thus, as a child, he had no coordinates to confirm his existence and had little to grasp reality. He relied almost entirely on inner arousal and visceral stimulation to feel anything, and thus sexualized almost every aspect of his existence. It was the only way to feel alive. But most excruciating, he became clear that his compulsive thoughts of sex with very young girls mostly involved his mouth and their genitals. He said, it is pure and simple nourishment, he said. It created, he felt, an oceanic, euphoric contentment, a pure experience of a non-toxic breast. A perverse fantasy, thinking about the fantasy, a perverse fantasy that nevertheless contains both the roots of restoration, the remediation of years of toxic nourishment ingested from his mother, and a manic flight and reversal that protected him from the grief and loss of the kind of nourishment and holding that he had never known. He dreamed that he was a child and that he was scared of himself, the adult Nick. Terrified that adult Nick was going to hurt child Nick, he became certain that his compulsion to child pornography was an attempt to do violence to himself, and I think murder himself. He was deeply identified with the child victims of the pornography, schooled to act as if the horror they are suffering is pleasurable. These young girls capture the abjection of his childhood, juxtaposed with the family's insistence that this was all a big, amazing adventure. Photos of him as a child he has recently found captured a persona of bravado that he had adopted to try and endorse and participate in the parents' fantasy of this big, bold adventure. He was finding himself in the child victims in the pornography. They too were acting as if this was a big and exciting adventure. These connections that he was making came with profound emotion, disgust. It's a very strong emotion, disgust and shock. But most excruciating, painful of all was his realization that he was also identified with the perpetrators. It was, after all, in the dream, the adult Nick who terrified the child Nick, alongside experiences of deflation and worthlessness, were experiences of himself as inflated and omnipotent. The family, in their manic and grandiose way, would endorse his childhood bravado, and they would refer to him as Nick the Great, which was both confusing to him but extremely elevating. He connected these states to the fantastical omnipotence of the perpetrators in the child pornography, who are above the law and above the very laws of nature, transcending their own abjection and humiliation by treating a child as a thing whose only purpose is enslavement, domination, and defilement. In the language of cohood and self-psychology, one would say it's a hypercathexis of the grandiose self. This double identification embedded in the child pornography, double identification with the victim and the perpetrator, thus contains both the psychic devastation of Nick's unrepresented trauma and its perverse transformation into omnipotence and power. All of this work brought Nick even closer to the experience of pain and breakdown that he was never able to suffer as a child, and sessions became the address for both intense sadness, grief, and sobbing, as well as visceral and wrenching anger with his parents. No longer viewed as a hero, he came to see his father as deeply traumatized person himself, who was totally dissociated and terribly damaging to Nick and his siblings. In the middle of this transformative work, Nick received an email from a slightly older female cousin who had stayed with his family for long periods during his childhood. In recent years, Nick had made efforts to reestablish a relationship with her. In the letter, she apologized and asked to make amends. She was also in a 12-step situation. She told him that she had been overly sexual and aggressive with him when they played as little children. Effectively, she had repeatedly molested him. Both Nick and I could hardly believe what he was saying, yet simultaneously felt a profound lifting of a heavy cloud. I recalled immediately and viscerally my experience years early of the enactment in the nursery that I told you about with the baby and so forth. I had held and contained a piece of his yet to be known and experienced suffering across many years. I too felt validated, and I had a weight for me lifted too. His rage and disgust with his cousin were only matched by his relief and gratitude to her for reaching out to him. He understood how complicated and painful her suffering has been. They subsequently had frank, very charged, but terrifically helpful conversations. I was very admiring of both of them to do this. It seemed remarkable to me. He found himself drawn to the porn again, and in his session he recalled that as a youngster he had loved Band-Aids, plasters. You say Band-Aids, right? He remembers feeling they were so cool, a not uncommon manifestation of latency age boys when they put Band-Aids on, yes? More memories came to him of countless small injuries, largely sustained around the apartment, filled with his father's found objects, dirty and aging metals, and all kinds of machinery. He remembers being in the park and his ungloved fingers freezing in the cold. He remembers his mother saying, "Don't worry, we're just having a great time." He cried. No one was there for him, and he wished and cried that I had been there for him. I would have protected him. I suggested that with me now, he felt sufficiently protected to finally experience pain and fear that he simply could not when he was a youngster. There was a promotion and advancement at work, and we were very involved with that in the therapy for a good time. What came into focus was never before was the way that he approached his work. Work is very important to talk about sometimes with people. He always approached every task as if it was a massive challenge. His customary and habitual approach would be to adopt an almost wild and total immersion in his work tasks. And amidst chaos and panic, he would somehow get things done. This time, feeling more safe and protected and more substantial in himself, he worked much more slowly than before, and he carefully mapped out the task, the personnel involved. He was now a manager of quite a big team, and the time frame to do the work. Along the way, it struck him that he had always worked at such a hurtling speed because, and such a great quote, he said, "Speed is safety." In the resulting frenzy and anxiety, he was able to not think and make connections. As with the pornography, he was lured by a fantasy of calm and connection amidst the frenzy. This time, he was thrilled to find he made charts and calendars and plans, and I commented that finally he was locating himself amongst others. In the next session, he told me that this comment had shone a light on the degree to which he had spent almost all of his life lost, unmoored, and rudderless. And my comment was very comforting. He said, I can feel a different focus now and a real tenacity. I know this is good. He likened the feeling to a kind and strong father's voice and lamented that the little boy Nick has been asking to be heard for years, and only now was big adult Nick able to respond with a kind father's voice rather than attack the small, needful child. He bought a big leather-bound planner and notebook within which to organize and keep his information. It was he knew he could use the online calendars and Google Cal and all these things, but it was important for him to have the actual object of the planner. He loved touching it and carrying it with him. Finally, he seemed to have created a transitional object that could carry him and he could carry it. Moreover, transitionality is what is so sorely missing in the world of child pornography. The ability to play and to create transitional spaces would seem to be a powerful element in the healing of this compulsion. Further, my emphasis is that my unobtrusively companioning him as he transformed his relation to his work, which of course captured his relationship to the world dominated by sadomasochistic object relations, where he always felt small and weak in a world of powerful adults. This fertilized the terrain of the treatment such that he could create his own transitional object and thus grow his own capacity for transitional space in a way that was very much made by him. One of the structural elements of the addiction to child pornography and pedophilia is the blurring of time and the omnipotent destruction and denial of limit, separateness, and order. Taking great pleasure from his new organizational capacities and finding his experience of work so much easier and productive, Nick told me with excitement that he felt it was a luxury to have a schedule. It felt luxurious. It felt solid. He said, I feel like an adult. I worked on my planner and my week. It works. It's self-care, and I'm getting so much done. Today, I saw myself in the mirror, and I saw the receding hairline, and I see for the first time, I am 50. I am an adult. I haven't seen that before. And I told him that this would seem to be what happens once you locate yourself. He is finding himself for who he is, and very importantly, relating to child pornography and the age he is. He is discovering time. Yes, he says, this is huge. I tell him that he's healing something rather than only putting a Band-Aid on it. He could never trust that he was kept in his father and mother's minds. And he talks about how important it feels to look at his planner, not only focusing on what he has to do in the future, but he can review what he has done in preceding days. He says that feels like a kindness. The Nick of yesterday is taking care of the Nick of tomorrow. And most importantly, he then comments that this is not about being perfect, but just about becoming a human being. And I say that because becoming human rather than striving to be perfect is most important, because the core of child pornography is the destruction and murder of humanity, of the child and of the perpetrator too. Humanity cannot be restored by all those behavioral interventions, and certainly not by incarceration. A lot of these men end up in prison, yes? It is created, humanity is created and grows along with transitional space, the relation to time and object constancy, and the appreciation of others and one's own humanity in a companion journey into one's interior. Okay.